Okay, so I mentioned in the previous video that maybe I'd do something with the UFO. I had put the image into the assets, but hadn't actually utilized it for anything. So kind of like Space Invaders, what's going to happen is the object is going to instantiate, and then it's just going to travel across the screen. So it's not going to do any damage to anything, and if you shoot at it, you get a bonus. That's really all it is. So, how do we do this? Well, since you're going to want to have multiple UFOs come out and not just once, what you're going to do is you're going to create what's known as a prefab. And I believe we already created prefabs in a different lesson, like the missiles are prefab. So we already have the idea of prefabs. That is, it's an asset you create, and then you can spawn it using the instantiate command. So similar concept for the UFO. It's going to be an object that's going to get spawned off screen and it's going to travel across the screen. So let's look to see how that would work. So game object create empty. Let's rename this. UFO. Add component. Rendering. And it's going to be sprite renderer. Take the UFO asset, drag and drop it onto the sprite. That's a little bit big. So let's shrink this. And there's two ways you can shrink an object. If you shrink the if you shrink the source image, then anything utilizing that image will shrink. Or if you shrink a specific object, only that one object will shrink. In other words, for the asset, you can come up here and change the pixels per unit. If you increase this number, it gets smaller. And yes, that sounds like a contradiction, but that's the way it works because it's a ratio. Since it's a ratio, if the number gets bigger, object gets smaller. Or you can click on the UFO object and scale it down to size. In this case, it really doesn't matter which way you choose because this object is actually going to be instantiated. So effectively, in this case, it's really the same thing. So let's just make this like 0.8 and 0.8. We don't want it to be too big. Okay, so we talked previously about colliders. So add component, physics 2D, and let's use polygon collider. That way it's form-fitting. So now it has a sprite component, so it has an image, has a polygon collider, so we can detect collisions. We need it to be a trigger. Now what we're going to do is we're also going to add the rigid body 2D. That way we can give it motion. We're going to have it travel across the screen. So physics 2D, rigid body 2D. We don't want any gravity because we don't want it to drop towards the ground. And I think that's about it. Now what happens if we move it off to where we want it to instantiate? That saves us a little bit of effort because we can just have it instantiate at its default location and not even have to think about it. So let's move it just off the screen and then take it, drag and drop it into our asset area. It is now a prefab. So we destroy the one that's here. And now we need to instantiate it. Well, what we can do is we already have a GM object that controls overall gameplay and the flow of the activities. So what we can do is if we put a variable in the script on the GM and we link it to this prefab, then the GM object can spawn the UFO, and what we'll do is we'll add a timer. I don't recall if we have any timers in here, but it uses what's known as IEnumerator. And what it does is it goes a certain amount of time and then spawns or does whatever it is that you want after that time has passed. So We already have our scripts open from our last session. GM. So we're going to add another transform. So public transform UFO OBJ. Again, using the OBJ suffix to indicate that it is an object. Again, this is arbitrary. It's just a naming convention that works for me. Save it. So there's the GM object. And there we go, UFO object. So we take our prefab, we put it there, and now the GM is aware of that prefab and can do things. It can instantiate it and other things of the such. But we need this to also have some... We need to have a script attached to the UFO itself to like control its speed and things like that. So the GM can instantiate it, but you really want the control to be self-contained. So right-click, create C#, and we'll call this UFO con, short for UFO control. And even though you've made a reference to this, you can still keep modifying this prefab. So you can just drag and drop the script, and now the prefab has a script. Let's go ahead and open that up. Okay, so in the start, we're going to give it its motion. So get component, rigid body 2D, dot velocity. Now, since we want it to move right to left, then that means we want it to have a negative x velocity. So equals new vector 2, since we're only using two of the directions. I think in some of these I might have used vector 3 out of habit. It's okay, it's interchangeable. As long as you're never actually trying to make a change to that that z-axis. So let's do -4, and I think we have to drop in the f if it's a fraction. You definitely have to use the letter f. So like say it's -4.2, you have to put the f after it. I don't recall if you have to do it just with the negative sign, but to be safe, you can put the f in. Doesn't hurt. We don't want it to move vertically, and that's it. We said it's a vector 2. So, as we said, the UFO has a rigid body that allows for the application of physics, and it is going to have a negative horizontal velocity. So we save that. Now, often, to add a timer, you need to use IEnumerator. But in this case, we don't have to, because self-destruct has an optional argument that lets you, well, I say self-destruct, but it's called destroy game object. It has an optional timer, so you can either just do destroy game object and the object immediately destroys, self-destructs, okay? Or what you can do is you can do destroy game object, comma, put in a period of time, and it waits for that amount of time. So if you know how long it's going to take for the UFO to travel across the screen, and you should if you're doing the math, because, or even if you're just running it and timing it, you can quickly determine what amount of time it's going to take. So in the start section, you just do destroying game object, and then say, let's try 6 seconds. All right, so now it travels across the screen. It destroys after 6 seconds. So that should be about it for the basic movement and self-destruction. We're still going to have to check for a collision and add to your score. So now we want the GM to instantiate that. So what we can do just to be just to test that this is working, we'll have the GM instantiate it right at the beginning. So in the start section of the GM script, just do instantiate that new object, so UFO object. So with instantiate, as a refresher, you have to declare three things: what is being instantiated, where it's being instantiated, and the rotation of the object. So what's being instantiated? UFO object. Where is it being instantiated? It's being instantiated at that object's default location. So UFO.object.position. So that's where it's being instantiated. And then its rotation, we're going to use the UFO's own rotation. Okay, so in the GM script, we added the new variable. We dragged and dropped the prefab onto that variable, and now we're instantiating that object at the start. That object has a script attached to it that gives it a -4 horizontal velocity and then destroys after 6 seconds. So we can't shoot it down yet, but it should instantiate and then travel across the top of the screen. And there it is. And since it goes off the screen, we want to make sure it's really self-destructing. So if you click on Window and then you click on Hierarchy, you can see if it's here. You can see that it's not. So the UFO was indeed destroyed. Just got the comments building up down here. So we know that's working. Another way to test is you could just cut this short, make it be 2 seconds, and just see if it self-destructs. Okay, so now we're probably not going to keep that. Excuse me, not that. We're going to keep that. That's the UFO control. This is what we're not going to keep. We're not going to have the UFO instantiate right at the beginning. Since it's a bonus, you really don't want to do that. You want to give them a chance to be making decisions and then decide do they want to use a missile on the bonus or not. So like if they're doing really poorly, they know not to waste a missile trying to shoot down the UFO. I mean, they can if they want to. So now what we're going to do is we now need to have this occur on a regular basis. So once again, we're going to need a variable, and that variable is going to be used to trigger the instantiation. So this just said go ahead and do it as soon as it starts. Why does it do it as soon as it starts? Because it's in the start section. So now we're going to actually add a new variable to handle that. So we might actually have to add a couple. So basically every so amount of seconds you want a new UFO to appear. If you want to be consistent with older games like this, wasn't necessarily a lot of complexity. So what you could do, so let's go down here, and we're going to do this a little bit out of order. So enumerator, and it's going to be, we'll call this UFO timer. Parentheses. So yield return new. Now typically I try to explain every part of a statement. Don't worry too much about what each word means. Just know the net effect is that this is what you do to create a delay. So yield return new, and you then do wait 4 seconds and then a measurement of time in seconds, of course. Okay. So it waits that amount of time. Then what happens after that? So this starts a timer, and then what's after this will not be performed until that time has been reached. And that's where we're going to take our instantiation command. We'll cut that, paste it here. actually, that should be all it takes. Well, we still need the command that says come down here and do this, and we need, as I said, a variable to make sure that to keep track that this is happening, because you don't want it to keep redoing this timer over and over again. So let's create that new variable. So public string, and we'll call this 1 at a time. And it's set to no, because we only want one UFO at a time. Probably not the best naming convention I've come up with, but gives you the idea that that's what it does. So this variable starts at now. So in the update section, I'm going to do, and make sure it's not inside of the if, it's separate. It's going to be its own if statement. So if 1 at a time equals no, which it starts off as, then we want this to be triggered. How we trigger it? So start coroutine, parenthesis, and then the name of the coroutine, and we said it is UFO timer, and there it is. So this is what I was talking about doing out of order, because you can't say go to such and such coroutine if you haven't created it yet. Oops, sorry, and there's parentheses after that. So it's there we go. So it's parenthesis, the name of the routine, which includes its own set of parentheses, and then the parenthesis closing out. And then we set 1 at a time is set to Y. So in other words, it starts off at no, immediately goes to the IEnumerator. Since it's going to the IEnumerator, we don't want it to keep going, so we only want it to do it once. And then once the UFO gets instantiated, this will get reset. So what this should do is it will wait 6 seconds and then spawn. So I think that should do it if I didn't forget anything. So let's see. There we go. 6 seconds and it appeared. Now, once it gets instantiated, what you can do is you can set the timer again. So this would go back to no. And now you have a cycle. This starts the coroutine, as that says, and then this resets it so it starts this again. So it becomes a cycle. So now it should keep appearing every 6 seconds. Now the problem is the amount of time that's on the screen versus how much time in between UFOs could be an issue. That it might look like it's the same UFO over and over again, so you actually might want more of a delay. So you could actually make this, say, like, let's make this like 12 seconds. Okay, there's the first one. There's your second one. So it's working. So that gives us our UFO. So now we just need to have it detect a collision, and when it detects a collision, it gets destroyed. So let's copy what we already did before. The comet already looks for a collision, so I'm on comet control. And what this says is, does it collide with boom, If so, score gets increased, destroy the game object. So really, we can copy this 100%. I'm not seeing any reason why we'd have to change any of that. Now, if you're trying to consolidate functionality and not have redundant code, technically what you could do is this could be in its own script, and then rather attaching just one script to an object, you could attach two scripts. So rather than having this redundantly written in more than one script, this would be in its own script that's attached to both objects. You can't always do that because sometimes things in here are dependent on other things in the script, but in this case, there really isn't. But for simplicity's sake, we'll just put it here. Because that kind of, what I just described, that's really when you get into optimization, code optimization. And again, none of the games I deal with require optimization. These are all very simple, low resource games. They're not resource intensive. So we'll save that, and what we'll do is we'll actually have this be 50. And then we'll come back here and change this because I don't feel like waiting 12 seconds. And let's see if I didn't break anything. It moves kind of quickly too, so. And it went up by 50. There we go. So just like that, you've now added a UFO. It's now optional. As far as they don't have to shoot at it, they can get a bonus. Maybe you would do other things. Maybe when you shoot the UFO, it actually drops a resource. So maybe when you shoot the UFO, you get 3 missiles. So you could do that. So that gets a little bit more complicated because what you'd have to do is you would have to create. First of all, you want an object on the screen. I suppose you don't have to. I suppose you could just have text appear saying, 3 missiles, missile times 3, whatever. But depending what you would do, since this is where the UFO is being destroyed, this is where you would do any other instantiation like, something. Let's do that. I'm kind of rambling on, but let's do it. So this number, so the amount of missiles that you have, I believe, is defined in GM, right? So public static remaining missiles. So what we have to do is we just have to increase that. So that's declared in the GM script. So remaining missiles plus 5. Because depending on how you balance the game, you might use missiles, destroy UFO, and now you don't have enough missiles to protect the cities. So by doing this, it's not just score, it's also extending gameplay. Oh, what did I do wrong? 2449 in UFO. Oh, sorry, plus equals. Okay. So, $19, $23. So as you can see that once you get the basic framework into place, you can just keep adding more and more features. Now, there's no cue on the screen there letting them know. So like I said, you'd either want to have, like you might instantiate a loot box, like a little crate, have it drop down. Or maybe you could just have text that says, it shows a picture of the rocket and says ×5 or something. So I think that's about enough for one lesson. We got a lot done. We added the UFO. We've added the bonus score. We've added a way to increase the amount of missiles that you have. And this is purely game balance. This was just the number you decide to put here is purely game balance. There's nothing magical or absolute. That was just an arbitrary number I chose, so it was obvious that it was working. So maybe one or two more lessons, little, bells and whistles. Um, Maybe we could put like right now there's not much in the background. Maybe we could use a particle system that has like stars, something like that. All right, so that's about it. If there's anything specific you want to see, just let me know. But like I said, I think we're getting towards the end of this particular project.